That beautiful noise. Hello and welcome, everybody. Glad to see you here tonight. Thank you for coming. I'm Andrea Packard. I'm the List Gallery Director, and I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's distinguished speakers, the 2018 Marjorie Heilman Visiting Artist, Donna Polseno and Ellen Shankin. I'm going to just say briefly a few words about why we invited these two artists to exhibit together. And then I'll introduce our first speaker, Ellen Shankin. She'll give a short presentation, and then we'll invite Donna to come up and speak about her work. And then we ask you to hold your questions until the end. We'll have a question and answer session, and then we'll meet more informally outside with refreshments. So we hope you can stay for that. But first, I'd like to thank the family of Marjorie Heilman for making this exhibition and lecture possible. Over the years, such opportunities have allowed us to welcome distinguished artists, seminal ceramic artists such as William Daly, Robert Turner, and Chris Daly. So these artists are following in a distinguished lineage. I'd also like to thank Swarthmore College Professor of Art, Sid Carpenter, for initiating this project, and my colleagues, Doug Heron, who built the pedestals, and also Betsy Hinsey here, who assisted in myriad ways. I'd also like to thank Louisa Lee, an Oberlin student who was a winter extern and who helped design the exhibit installation, and also our remarkable List Gallery interns, Elizabeth Whipple, Blake Oding, Maral Guyani, and Zena Wang, who are all here. They helped tremendously with the installation and have prepared a wonderful reception for you later. Additionally, I'd like to thank Phil Unetic, who's really one of the best graphic designers. I see him in the back, and also makes ceramic works. And he designed this catalog. We have complimentary copies for you later, and it has a much more thorough introduction to the work of the artists and their many accomplishments. So please look at it later. For now, I try to be brief, but I do want to first thank the artists for their own incredible generosity and welcome when I went to visit them in Floyd, Virginia, to curate their exhibit and research their work for the catalog. So thanks to both of you. Titled Embodied Forms, Donna Polseno and Ellen Shankin, the current exhibit brings together recent works by both artists, most from just the past year, that demonstrate the kind of mastery that can be achieved if you just study and practice for 40 years. The exhibit reflects their many shared affinities and inspirations, as well as very distinct ways of building forms and embellishing them. In the foreword to the catalog, the preeminent ceramic artist Wayne Higby praises Donna Polseno and Ellen Shankin for approaching complex problems with, quote, inventive assertion, originality, and uncanny skill. And if you've ever tried to make a pot, you will indeed be in awe of their work. He also celebrates their work as, quote, a buoyant, generous ode to life. Both Ellen and Donna were mentored by Wayne Higby at different times, and he introduced them to each other in 1977, and the resulting friendship, which as you can see if you saw them down here, it's very close, has catalyzed and supported their art for more than 40 years. They were influenced by the Back to Nature movement that coincided with the Vietnam War era and its aftermath. And they both felt, coming out of school, that they would like to live and work in a rural area where they could focus on the aesthetics most important to them. So in the late 1970s, Donna moved to Floyd, Virginia, with her husband, the noted artist Richard Henley, and Ellen and her husband, Brad Worsler, a woodworker, joined them soon after. And during their first year in Floyd, Ellen worked in Donna and Richard's studio. Correct me if I get any of this wrong. But the family subsequently helped each other raise their children and build each other's homes and studios and overcome life challenges. So one of those challenges was the evolving art market. And in 1998, they were among the founding members of 16 Hands, which was one of the first regional craft tours in America and one of the most enduring. So both Donna and Ellen have found community and inspiration through such efforts, and also through teaching, participating in artist residencies, and travel, particularly to Tuscany, Italy. And although they've pursued contrasting approaches over the years, building and embellishing forms in different ways, they both create works that are notable for their architectonic presence, their rich surface textures, and their allusions to nature. Elaborating ancient traditions, they model the way functional ceramics can help us transcend our everyday ways of seeing and reawaken our sense of wonder. So that's my feeling about some of their shared affinities. Let me now, for a moment, focus on our first speaker, Ellen Shankin. Ellen was born in New York City in 1952, and she was drawn to working in clay at an early age. She took some courses at Goddard College, where she met the internationally acclaimed Australian artist Gwyn Henson Piggott. And then she went on to study at the Rhode Island School of Design, where she studied ancient Japanese pottery traditions and became interested also in Chinese Han Dynasty pots and their anthropomorphic presence. She went on to receive a BFA with honors from the New York School of Ceramics at Alfred, one of the most notable schools for ceramics in the country. And while there, when she was mentored by Wayne Higby, he emphasized a lesson that has stuck with her, quote, "Whatever you do either contributes to or takes away from the pot. Nothing is unimportant." So her ability to distill this lesson, integrating form, function, and surface treatment, has been recognized with numerous opportunities and awards, including a 1990 fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, an award that led to opportunities around the United States to teach and exhibit. She's taught at more than 50 universities and leading craft schools in the U.S. and abroad, and exhibited at more than 150 exhibitions, including internationally at Adnan Franco Sanat Gallery in Turkey and the Reykjavik Art Museum in Iceland. Her works are represented in numerous museums, including the International Museum of Ceramics at Alfred, the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and the Crocker Art Museum, just to name a few. Her work has also been written about or profiled in periodicals such as Studio Potter, Ceramics Monthly, American Craft, and 15 notable surveys of ceramics arts. And so it is a privilege to learn from her as an artist and as a person, and to experience her personal warmth and generosity. So I hope you'll join me in first welcoming a most wonderful artist and person, Ellen Shankin.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you for that amazing introduction. And I guess I would just start by saying it is just so wonderful to have been chosen to have this exhibition here. Donna and I have just loved our time we've spent here on this gorgeous campus, walking around in what feels like a lot more spring-like weather than we have in the mountains at home. And I want to thank Andrea. I feel like I've learned so much about the art of curating and that catalog. Whoever you are introducing up there who did that catalog, it was just a beautiful, beautiful piece. So thank you very much. And Sid for even putting this whole idea together. So let me find my... Okay, so I thought I would start a bit historically with myself, just to say that when somebody commits to something as early in life as I did, I got exposed to clay at 13, and by 18, I already knew this is what I wanted to do. But I find it sort of interesting to realize that for some people, like one of my teachers, it was historical pots that drew them. So like this beautiful Jomon pot from ancient Japan. It was not historical pots that drew me. I mean, I was a kid in New York and I'd been to museums, but it at 13 blew right by me. For some people, contemporary American ceramics, that, is a thing that drew them into it, and it was like, oh, they would see the work and they would want to be able to make that. But I never looked at anybody's pots. For some, grandma's tea set, it's like all the pretend play you had as a kid. These are all so many reasons from other potters that I meet of why they dug deeply into this and never played with grandma's tea sets. And then there are those people with the fire. I mean, there's the whole wood fire world where they see the drama of that. I didn't even really know that pottery and fire had anything to do with each other in the early stages. It was the clay. It was always the clay. I got exposed to the material and the magic of throwing, and I don't think for probably 5 years I could have cared one little bit what I was throwing. Sewer tiles, didn't matter. It was that I was spending my time with this material, striving for mastery and feeling magic. And that was the first commitment. The second commitment came when I met Gwen Hansen-Piggott. She was my teacher, and she became a very close friend. And while her work was more in this vein when I knew her, wood-fired. She lived in the center of France. She fired a wood kiln. She did beautiful work, but it wasn't her work or her career or anything heady at all. It was, she told me what it meant to her to be a potter, like inside, what it was, how her time was spent, how she felt connected through centuries to ancient traditions, and even, in that back to nature movement, the earth, wind, and fire business of it. I mean, it just all super resonated. She got very well known later in life, way later. Back in the day when I knew her, she worked with Bernard Leach and Michael Cardew. She was quite a known figure, but in her later life, she did these, what she called parades or still lifes, based on a lot of Morandis, paintings, and very pure forms, this is cone 13 for the potters in here, cone 13 porcelain that's absolutely transparent. So that was the second leg. I loved the clay. I thought it was a meaningful, deeply meaningful life. And then I had to go learn about how to actually, what I was going to make with it, learn about pottery and learn about form. But in jumping a little bit ahead, it led me to, this is Floyd. This is a view from the hill above my house. And I wanted a really rural existence, someplace where I could just make lots of pots and lead a very peaceful life. And I have a half a mile long driveway. I don't see anybody's lights. I'm really sort of out there in the middle of nowhere. I'm loving it very deeply. And we built our house, which was like the first enormous design project I ever got to walk around in. So we designed it, we built it, and honestly, I think had I not been a potter, I would have been an architect. And in the positive, negative thing of misogyny, if I were a boy, I would never have been allowed to be a potter. I would have been forced to be the architect. But that's that house any number of years later. But for me, architecture and pottery have so much in common besides just shape. It's how space is transformed by use, how when you understand your rituals and your behaviors and your activities, and if you design from the inside out like that, then you end up having spaces that really resonate. It's like it's no longer a building, it's a home. It's no longer just the cup on the counter. It's what you are reaching for when you have morning coffee, and it's all about understanding how space is made use of. So architecture has always been something that resonated for me. And of course, this is a Japanese farmhouse. In this, it's pretty easy to imagine how I see that as lids and jars and feet, foundations and walls, and not that I'm actually trying to create a building when I see it, but it is something is translated about the oppression, that deeply pressing down roof, translated itself into this cover jar for me. I think when I'm traveling, it's buildings that get me probably more than anything, and they find their way in some manner into, at least in my own mind, into the forms that I'm making. And it was mentioned that we had traveled to Turkey. Donna and I traveled to Turkey together with a bunch of artists on a project, and just the completely different types of architecture we experienced. And I don't have any images of this, but the graveyards, that tomb jar that's in the exhibition came from the graveyards in Turkey. But just ways of taking these experiences of these structural shapes that we got to walk around in and experience and put them toward the pots. So then there's this aspect of I'm in a bigger conceptual way, I'm drawn to architecture, but then there are the details. And so line and edge has always been probably the biggest obsession for me in what I make. And there's so much evidence of line formed by wind with beautiful shapes in nature. And I think about those things when I'm adding anything. I was talking with Sid's class this afternoon about the continuity of line, the way it grows out of things and goes back into them. I spend a lot of time and pleasure. Really, it's the pleasure of it, finding those planes and exaggerating them. This more wonderful edge. And even as that travels into the lip of the picture, that's not unconsidered. It's like where the bulk of my consideration in making, even though the picture is a big form, the bulk of that consideration is how the handle was attached and how it transitions from the rim to the spout. My husband is a woodworker, so we're often looking at wood together, and sometimes it's the weirdest things that inspire form. The Craftsman vase in the exhibition downstairs came from that mission furniture. And there's a lot about the Craftsman era in the wood, not in ceramics, but in wood, that I resonate with in terms of they have such attention to the joint. We spoke this afternoon in class about transition and about when you attach something, and the Craftsman era said all of this joinery is the source of beauty in this work, and so they take a darker peg and they peg the wood so that not so that it will disappear, but so that you will see the beauty of the joinery. And I think about that a lot with pottery. It's either gone, the attachments and blendings are either organically disappearing or they're screaming for you to look at them because they're pretty like this. So Han Dynasty. So it took me so many years to even care about pottery, as I was saying. I just cared about the wheel and the clay. And when I first started looking at historical pots, these were some of the earliest ones that really resonated for me. Maybe not so surprising that it's a building, right? So I already love buildings. another Han Dynasty piece. And for me in this piece, there is so much continuation of line, negative space, the shape of the impressed forms. Um, these are images that have been within sight in my studio, in my notebooks, like for 40 years. And while I don't make crusty, wood-fired pieces, I just want to stand like this when I see this pot. It's just like it's so filled with vitality and breath that I aspire to that aspect of a pot like this. And then these are a Han Dynasty boat, just sort of searching around during a transition time in my life for boat imagery that would get that out of the way. So that was a boat form that I was making for a while. And when I was making pots, like this is a little Shigaraki inkwell, and what I loved about this and what I wanted to have for myself was, to me, this looks like it was born looking like this. Like nobody decided to do something and make it be this. It was just so right. And so in the early days when I first went to Floyd, I was doing salt-fired work. And I did that for, I don't know, maybe 8 years until I caught Donna's roof on fire. And I had to have put my kiln in the garbage. Didn't cause any damage, but it did catch fire. So I did salt fire work for about 8 years. To me, I felt like there was something a little bit like that Shigaraki pot. It just kind of felt as natural. I sprayed colorants and things on so that I didn't want brushwork. I didn't want something that at that time felt mechanical or human. I wanted something that felt rock-like and natural. But after I caught the rafter on fire and I had to destroy that kiln, I had to commit to making another kiln. And I decided that I needed more possibilities of surface. I couldn't just stick with the salt. And so I built a reduction kiln, and it's like even when I look at this teapot after seeing the salt, I just want to sigh. It's like, in a way, such a relief to have such a quiet surface. And so I've been working in a reduction kiln since then, gas-fired. And even though I do like the quiet, I am interested in some of that, I call it a snotty quality that the salt offered. But I can get it through reduction as well. So it was a good choice for me to have switched to reduction and been able to find both types of surfaces. So my pots are really 90% about form. That's what I think about. I've had to come up with glazes that work on my forms, but honestly, the biggest pleasure is in designing and working with and following those obsessions with line and designing forms that please me. And in 40 years, you go through a lot of different series of work, things that you do for a period of years and then never do again. And I felt very strongly that I was going out into the world to fill a need. You need to store sugar, you need to have a place for butter and for soup and for iced tea and for, I wanted to address those requirements, and function is king for me. It's really for me very wonderful to have to really investigate deeply the limitations that function offers, and then bounce around as freely as I can within them. But it doesn't please me to have a picture that doesn't feel right, even if it looks gorgeous. It really has to pour and feel right. And I've gone through a lot of different surface in the reduction aspect. For me, this series of teapots came about a high handle and a high spout, and then shrugged shoulders. And then I can go for years on those 3 words. So this is a good example of a kind of tautness that I'm looking for in my work. Kind of wanted that to feel like there were metal bars inside that picture, and someone was applying pressure on top and bottom. And it requires a real attention to that line to create that illusion of breath coming out. But it's totally the part of this that I love. Soup tureen. So I'm often throwing on the wheel and then ovaling and squaring and making other shapes evolve out of it. Fluting. It's a little hard to tell, but it's only about 2 inches deep. It's a flask, basically, a tall flask. A short flask. That's quite a large, maybe 18-inch fruit bowl, very oval. For me, once again, it's like the devil is in the details. So how that handle grows out of the rim and comes back into it, that's the success or failure of the form for me. I would say that probably the picture is maybe one of my favorite forms. It has so many possibilities and so many restrictions. It's the only form I feel like needs to have delight to pick up. Everything else just needs to be even. These are vases that are sort of made from bowls, very low. I like to carve, and I like peaceful time in the studio. Carving is that for me. Make dinnerware. That red glaze is very quiet. It likes a carved surface, and I enjoy giving it that. Very domestic pieces, things that hopefully are used continuously. This was a form I had tremendous pleasure from over the years. It was a way of approaching clay that had like endless manifestations, and I enjoyed playing with every one of them. I ended up making a lot of things, pieces that look like this. There's a piece like this, similar in the exhibition across the road. The way spouts integrate, the way lids are on, the way knobs are done, all of those little details, like Wayne said, fully considered, hopefully are all contributing to the same language of the piece. like that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm just going to have a little light so I can see. That was too brief, but wonderful. And now I'd like to introduce Donna Polseno, who, like Ellen Shankin, Donna creates functional vessels that engage viewers with defined geometric volumes and sinuous curves. But in addition, in tandem with that body of work, she also creates a variety of figurative and sculptural works. Born in 1950 in Connecticut, Donna was encouraged by her father to pursue art. He was a noted painter of landscapes. And her eclectic interest in ceramics emerged early on while pursuing her BFA at the Kansas Art Institute, where she studied with the noted artist Ken Ferguson. In Kansas City, she often visited the Nelson Atkinson Museum, taking inspiration from its collection of Yuan and Han Dynasty ritual vessels. And she, as was mentioned, went on to meet and be mentored by Wayne Higby. And then she went on to receive an MAT from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1974. So after she established her studio in Floyd, Virginia, she pursued functional wear, supporting herself primarily for that, but also gaining critical recognition for her hand-built vessels. So her diverse bodies of work have received numerous awards, including 2 fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and a Virginia Museum Artist Grant. And she's also been awarded artist residencies at leading institutions, including just to name a few, the Archie Bray Foundation for Ceramic Arts, Dokuz Eylul in a university in Izmir, Turkey, and Jingdezhen Institute for Ceramics in China. She has taught there, I think, one of our former students, Alex Anderson. She's exhibited her work at museums and other distinguished venues throughout the United States, including the Seattle Art Museum, the Renwick Gallery, California Museum of Art, and the Kennedy Museum of Art at Ohio University. And she's taught at leading institutions, including Alfred University, University of Michigan, and Ohio State University, and the leading craft schools, just to name a few, Penland School of Crafts, Anderson Ranch, and Haystack Mountain School of Crafts. She currently teaches part-time at Hollins University, where she is also adjunct curator for ceramics at the Taubman Museum, and she directs Women in Clay, an annual symposium. How does she do it all? In addition, since 2007, she has taught during the summer at La Meridiana School of Ceramics in Certaldo, Italy. And her work has been profiled in numerous periodicals, including Ceramics Monthly, American Crafts, Sculptural Ceramics, and the New York Times. Like Ellen, she enjoys having her work collected by numerous museums, including the American Museum of Ceramic Art, the St. Louis Museum of Art, the Kansas City Art Institute. But such lists do not do justice to the beauty and humanity of her art. You can find out much more of it in person in the list gallery later, but for now I give you one of the most warm and generous artists I've ever met, Donna Polseno. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. You're so generous and have done so much for us. And I don't want to reiterate too much as Ellen did, but for Sid and Andrea especially, we're just been incredibly honored, and of course feel the warmth of your support. And it's just been a wonderful connection, and endlessly grateful. Okay, wait a minute, I have to exit, right? And I can't see. Okay, there it is. Okay, okay. Let's see. Nope, very quick. First, play from start. Yes. track of this. Tell me if you can't hear me at any point because I drift away sometimes. Um, I'm going to try and bring three threads together because, as in the catalog and in the show, there are sort of three bodies of work that are, are related and yet separate. And so I've tried to divide this into three threads to bring together. My I grew up. My father was a painter, as Andrea said, and a naturalist, and someone who really gave me such a love of nature and took me on bird counts, and we were always, he just had a way of really articulating what was around me in a way to really notice and appreciate. And so after I graduated, my husband and I were going to move after graduate school, and we were going to move to the country because we loved it and it seemed like an economically good idea. But at one point, my husband decided maybe we should just stay in the city, artists stay in the city. And I actually cried until he let us move to the country. So these are a lot of the pieces. This is from the 70s when I first started out. Wayne Higney got me interested in raku. This is what my functional work is. So I was never as functional a potter in the tradition that Ellen was. I made vessel, more of a vessel orientation. So these are the two pieces that represent about 5 or 6 years of my work. And then we're going to, you can see that there's a lot of the Asian kind of influence from my education and from my love of nature. And you'll see it reoccurring. So I'm going to now jump to the early 2000s, where we're going to go back and fill in a few of the gaps. But this is a body of work I started working on about 15 years ago. And it went back to my interest in making marks and in nature. And this is a Tang Dynasty platter, and I show this as an example of how something inspires, an idea. And this was a platter. That was the first time I went to teach in China. And this was a platter that I made soon afterwards. And I always like seeing things, Ellen's pictures were so wonderful to see what inspires something and then how an artist interprets it. It's if you copy something, it's not art, and I'm just always so fascinated by that. I think that you'll see, because of my interest in the figure at the same time, a lot of my forms have a bit of a figurative feeling to them on purpose. Those were two kind of small ewers. I live part of the time in Italy, and I go out and collect branches of things and grasses and flowers, and I bring them back to my patio and I photograph them as still lifes just for inspiration, for marks and ideas for my pottery surfaces. I'm really interested, and always have been, in a real richness and surface, very similar to Ellen, just created in a different way because of my also more decorative approach. But it's that richness, that pulling you in, like her work, that it draws you in, and it has a mystery. And I've always been extremely attracted to that, and I've tried to create it in many different aspects of my work. And I feel like this glazing that I've started doing on this pottery in the last 15 years is really, really satisfying in that way, that it's something that has really interested me for a long time. One winter, I started sculpting these birds because I am a sculptor also, and my father had a part of his life where he was very famous for bird paintings. He evolved to be more famous for his landscapes. Did a little bit of everything like me, some still life, some portraits. But I just started sculpting these little birds one winter in the evenings when I didn't want to go out to the studio at night. And I wasn't even really sure what I was going to do with them, but I started putting them on the edges of these pieces. And this is a vase, the flowers will come out in between the birds, so they look nestled when they're filled. So I went to China again, second time, and I saw this Han Dynasty fountain, and I was just so taken that I was already doing these little birds on these pieces, but it gave me this sense of more ideas and just sort of a vindication. And I told my husband, I must have been a Han Dynasty princess. I mean, I love these, the Han Dynasty. And Ellen and I are like, Han Dynasty. Also, just so many of the things. This was just the way the roof tiles are, and the fact that there were the little birds up there also was just too precious. And so when I came home, I started really mixing up and using the birds in different kinds of clusters and trying to really increase the conversation between them. Just trying the simple, the essence of some of my things are very complicated patterns and decorations, and some of them are just quiet, sitting out in the field, as simple as they can be. And the way the glazes are used is so important to make them move just a little bit, but not too much, and have that richness to them. This is another one of my little still lives, and inspiring the forms, the decoration on a ewer form. I was already painting a lot of the bird images. I never painted birds. I'd done leaves and flowers and grasses for many years, and I never painted birds until, it was 15 years after my father had died that I thought, well, maybe I could attempt a bird. And I think it's really when you start using imagery on a three-dimensional form, it's such a challenge to make it one and the same with the form, that it's not to distract from the form, it only to add to the form. And I've made a million that didn't work at all, but that is really a challenge every single day when I go to my studio to think about how I will embellish the surfaces of the pieces. My glazing is to get the richness. I put many layers of glaze. So there's really conceptually, there's a lot to trying to see the whole when I start, because I don't just sit down and paint like a painter. I have to build the layers of the glazes. And you can see in these bases that figurative kind of element that when you see the figurative pieces will. Now, this is a kimono. I love textiles. I think a lot of my surfaces have been more inspired by textiles than they actually have been inspired by ceramics. This is just a print I saw on a friend's wall, and I just loved it. And I started doing that. Was the beginning of the space series. There's like the piece in the show. And birds. This is a piece that is created by a lot of technical research to find ways to build up the glazes so that they break apart in the ways I want, and you see through them the way they want, and they're thicker in one part and thinner than the other, and the flow of all of them. And it's very different. It's so different than painting, than when you can just have an idea and you paint it down. Ceramics is an endless challenge to bring your ideas through all of the technical processes that you have to. And it's something that you just have to love so much to have the patience to go through. I spend endless hours walking. I'm a walker, and I just collecting these on my walks in Italy, but I walk for hours and hours and hours. And it's just a meditation for me. So when I started this project of collecting the things to bring home, and then have this whole project of arranging them and putting them and photographing them on my terrace, my studio in Italy is tiny. It's teeny, teeny, tiny, and Rick and I both work in it. So I do a lot of other things in terms of the creative process as well when I'm there. And this is this one is so delicate. So I've been recently doing these pieces that I'm just trying to make them as delicate as they can and try and nestle into a form like this, with the negative space and the balance and how many objects there are. And I draw for days. When I just take enough pots to fit in my kiln, I spread them out and I take days and days and days to just draw them. I draw them with a pencil before I start doing all of the lines, waxing and building it up. This is where I live. This is my deck in Virginia, so you can see that I love being in nature like Ellen. And this is where I walk in Italy, above my little village, one of my many walks. But I love the city. It's so interesting to be in a city for the energy and so many things about culture in it. But I am just my soul is just needs to live in the country. Okay, so we're going to start another thread. This is just the only old funky piece that's kind of been in my studio forever that I made in graduate school. I made a whole series of three-dimensional, like they were sculptural tiles. They were about this big, and they were little still lives. And so I'm just trying to bring you through the thread of these still life pieces that are in the gallery. This was a painting that my father did. He wasn't really a still life painter, but I love this painting. It's so quiet and so beautiful. I've had it for 25 years. This is a series of still lifes that I did on pieces. I'm just showing you very few of them. I did many of these big urns and a whole series of bowls that all had still lives on them in bas relief. And on these particular large urns, these were fired in a salt kiln. There was a figure on the other side, so it was a whole story. But I show them to you to see that all of a sudden I'm doing these still lives, and the people are saying, "What are these still lives about?" And I'm like, "Well, they're also my story from way back." So in this still life story, after I got sort of tired of the birds, like I've done so many different things, and you just get, you get tired of something, your work changes. So after years of those birds, I just thought I want to put something else on the vase or on a pedestal. So I had this idea of just putting a series of vases on a pedestal, and it would have a similar kind of feeling. And so then I said, oh, I want them to be more like a still life. They're not just a series of vases. I'm going to change the size of them and the scale of them and put them on a bigger pedestal, so it will be kind of like a painting, and it will still be a vase. And then I was teaching in Italy one summer, and I made this as an example to my students of a very sculptural kind of vase. And so I sort of added fruit, and I kind of broke, farther from that idea of it just being a vase. And I work in this earthenware in my own studio in Italy too, this Italian earthenware. And then someone said, don't you look at Giorgio Morandi's paintings? And I said, well, I know them, but so I started looking at them more, and it's just intrigued me more and more about the idea of putting these objects together and in a three-dimensional way. And so then I started making, like other objects that tell a story, as well as have to do with the negative space and the different scale of pieces and the tension created in the pieces by how you arrange them. And so I started making tons of objects and playing with them and putting them together in these still lives. And so, these two pieces were a year apart. So, here I am. I've been making ceramics a long time. The scale, in a presentation like this, when I have a limited time, I think, well, that was 5 years. I did those, and now I'm doing something else. But this is, a marching story that came over the last, several years. So then I made a series that were just white. This is, and so that the light and shadow would be, more and more important in it, in creating so many different shapes and spaces. But I realized all of a sudden I just craved my color, only because unless this piece was lit just perfectly, it wasn't as interesting as if it was, in a certain situation. So I thought, well, I'm going to be brave and start putting color in it and using some of the ideas from my my glazing on my pottery. And so trying to position some of the patterns with the quietness, and so that the forms are the most important part of it, in spite of using some color. And to me, they tell, besides a story of visual interest, they tell a story for me, about the objects that I put in them. And the other one in the gallery, called my father's studio, is, example of that. I'm still trying to tell a story with them. So the other thread is my figurative work, which this is sort of a few years, sort of transitioning from the raku pieces that I showed very early on, in my very early 30s. My mother died, quite young, and so I realized I wanted to have more life. I had been doing those forms were all very geometric, and so they were a nice canvas, in a way, for the motifs that were on them. But I realized I needed to have them more alive in some way, and I didn't really think about the figurative element. This was still just a vessel, and thinking about rich, deep surfaces and ways that I was creating them, and still relying more on a vessel in that way. But I kept saying I want them to have more life in them. And so as I wanted to have more life in them, they started to have more gesture and movement and more life pushing out of them. And from that point on in my life, the need to make more sculptural things always came from, has continued from real life events that I always understood were universal things that humans experienced. And so I always felt really grateful that I had a way to express those things for myself. And this is just a small figurative vase, and it's not indicative of all of the ones I did. When I finished with the raku and I started making these figurative pieces, they started getting bigger, and as you'll see, and more figurative, and I couldn't really make a living anymore. I had been making a living. My husband and I are both potters. We were making a living, and I couldn't anymore. It was just, I would sell one once in a while. So I started making these vases that were derivative of and inspired by my own sculptures, but they were more functional. And so I just made them, and then I made molds of them, and I started slip casting them so that I could create them, in a way, like throwing in a wheel or something else. I chose that way for a sculptural object. And so for 10 or 12 years, I made a whole variety of these. I'm not showing you anymore. I'm just showing you that in a parallel life, I was actually supporting myself in that way, which is important, from the point of view of being an artist and how hard it is to make a living as an artist. And I was so determined to be independent and be an artist and live where I wanted to live that I was willing to be. My own father said to me when I told him, well, I'm not really making a living, and we had a child, and my husband was getting a little burnt out, and my father said to me, Donna, I can't believe, with all the talent you have, that you are not resourceful enough to find a way to still make a living as an artist. So I did. And at the same time, it allowed me to move forward with this other work. And so the pieces became extremely figurative after a near-death experience that I had, a terrible accident. And so I felt so grateful to have survived this that I wanted really to make. All of a sudden, those works really became figurative. I just started pushing out, and they were all inspired by like fertility goddesses. And so it was just a matter of how much life could I get in them. And it was, they were quite large and just curvy and full, and still using, like color and design and pattern, and trying to create very rich surfaces. And in the very beginning, I made them quite simple on the surfaces, but I realized, I don't want to put too much motif on them because it will take away from the form. And it was really a question for me. But then I realized that I saw an exhibition in a museum about body art, and that humans often embellish their bodies during real transitions, puberty or life transitions, and that was a way to sort of celebrate it. And so I thought, no, it's okay if I embellish them because I'm not the same person as I was, before. And so I gave myself permission to try, but once again, to try and make surfaces that make sense with the figure and or the form, and it's a big challenge. One time Ellen sent me a picture years after I made this piece. She found a picture, I've lost it, I wish I could find it again, of a Neolithic figure with a woman with spirals all over her body. Do you remember that, Ellen? It was amazing, and I've lost it. And I had already made these pieces, but I thought, oh my God, things are, humans have so much in their DNA about what they express, like in so many ways. It just gives you a sense of that things make sense in a kind of way. Like, Neolithic people in one part of the world, in a totally different part of the world, use some of the same motifs or methods, and it's an incredible thing about being a human. But you can see, that the gesture, the kind of fullness, the surfaces, and then I started raising them up to express the tentativeness, the sense of precariousness of life that seems, it's a theme that has continued on my work all the way through to this day. I think I balance two different things, and one of them is what I always say: life turns on a dime, and how we accept that and how we move on from it in a personal, emotional, and spiritual way. And so I go back and forth between things that are very precarious and then things that are very serene. And I think that those are the two things that I'm continually trying to express with this work. So I put them up on these pots and up high to set them, off in this precarious way. And then I thought, oh, I'm going to start putting the pots with the women because they're both symbols of nourishment and the containment of the spirit of life. And so I started a long, long series of women holding pots in different ways. Either in this is one of the very tranquil pieces and sort of meditative pieces. I think this and all very ritualistic in a way. I think I've always been inspired, besides fertility goddesses, but Tang Dynasty figures I absolutely love. Cycladic figures and Hindu figures are one of my absolute favorite. They really resonate with me because I am also trying to express something that is very spiritual. So there's this piece, the vessel and the pot are so similar in their shape, and they're different, and yet they're very similar. And so I'm really trying to talk about that contrast and that similarity at the same time. This is, a very meditative piece of a woman holding a vessel in another way. This is a series of pieces that, this is a piece that is 8 different figures, and they're all, I'm a practitioner of yoga, and these are all in the tree pose, a form of a tree pose. There's several, but and balancing a pot on their head, and in their feet there are rusty nails, clay, eggshells, rose petals, sand. I forget all of them, but there are all these different things just to express the idea that one is always trying to balance, whether it's in a very real, practical way or in a spiritual way, all the different things that happen in a life. Some of them wonderful and a bed of roses, and others rusty nails. And this is a piece called The Woman on the Edge, and she's on the edge of a cliff and she's balancing a water jar. And I love this because for me, as I said, all my pieces come from my own life experience, me trying to, express something. And this came from a very difficult time in my life. that I felt like I was really on the edge of the cliff. And after I set this show up, it was in a palazzo in Italy. A woman came in who is a friend of mine, and she said, "Wow, she's dancing! It's wonderful." And I thought that's the wonderful thing about art, because whatever you feel is right. I just want you to feel something. This is a woman. Rebirth is what it is, but it's also that precariousness. She's rising up out of the water and the kind of rebirth. This is a woman balancing on it. It's a huge steely shape, like a rock, and the face of it is carved, to be like a hieroglyph, inspired by hieroglyphs that I saw deep in the jungle of the Yucatan, and I wanted to do it. And so I just took pieces of a life. I took pieces of my life, but I said it can be anybody's life. They're very generic in a way, but they are very personal to me. And so you're balancing up there. This is the life that you've balanced your way through so far. And this is a kind of more recent piece until this last series of just balancing on the rocky waves. And I've started to use, this was the beginning of starting to use more glazed surfaces and patterns on the figures, which is the current work that you'll see in the gallery. And these pieces, for me, after all the other pieces that are very, a few of these are still twisted and turned with the kind of energy that you saw in some of my earlier pieces, but they're also really about, a kind of a state of grace or tranquility, very inspired by figures that I saw in Southeast Asia, and they're made in pieces and meant to be in pieces visually. Some of them are glued, and some of them are, temporarily put together. But the pieces, they're meant to represent like a quilt. They're all of the stages of a life that I'm sure I wouldn't have made this piece when I was young. I'm sure it's related to getting to a certain age of that I'm the person of all those stages and all those parts, just like a person collecting all the fragments of fabric in a life and putting them together as a quilt. And this is the similar theme, and a kind of just trying to express a kind of serenity. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you both for this wonderful joint talk. And it's time for the reception, but we want to invite some questions, and particularly from students, if there's anybody who'd like to ask either or both of the artists a question.
Hi, thank you guys so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot. I was wondering if you guys could talk briefly about accidents or frustrations you encounter in your work. Not that they're always the same thing, right? But yeah.
I'll stand by this microphone.
Okay.
Yeah, that way.
Accidents and frustrations. Well, I think in a ceramic world, there couldn't be a field with more accidents and frustrations. I mean, I'm always saying, it's like, here I have this picture, and there are probably 17 different ways that it can be ruined. And 15 of them show up all the time. So, I mean, there is the accident that leads to another thought, and that can be pretty inspiring. But there's also just a lot of darned annoying frustrations.
Yeah, my husband always have a joke that if you can't get through the pain and suffering of ceramics, get out early. But so it is really important. But I also think that the learning experience is just as important to note, because I will tell you briefly that before, after the accident that I hadn't worked for a very long time, and I finally went back to my studio. I made a piece. I thought, okay, at least I've broken through. I'm back to work. and it felt so good. And I put this very thick slip-on that I was using in those days, and I went downstairs and I told Rick, I said, okay, I have finished a piece. This is huge. I heard a huge thud. It was on the ground. It slaked itself down and fell on the ground. And that piece was like the piece as similar to the piece that I had made before, 6 months earlier, because just to I didn't know where else, I didn't know where to start. And I quite quickly after I cried said, I'm not that person anymore. I just needed to put my hands in it, and it allowed me to move on. So I think they're very important.
Great question. Another question. Can I hand this to you?
Donna, on your figurative pieces, what are your techniques in terms of construction? And do you always start from the base up?
Yeah, I just coil build them. It's an easy one.
Another question? Any other students? Oh, non-students? Maybe you can hang on 2 seconds.
This is, I think, primarily directed toward Donna, but both of you, I'm sure, have some insights into this. When you're making a change between one style or form and another, or in the case of working with functional work and your sculptural work, do you find can you work on the two at the same time? Do you have to shift your mindset from one to the other? If you could just talk a bit about the transition process, either between two different types of forms, or mediums, say sculptural versus functional, or radical changes in form when a new idea comes up.
Well, first I'll address the radical idea. I really have gotten to the place many times where I actually thought physically I couldn't do that anymore. I just thought, I don't have that love. I don't have the juice anymore. I physically can barely do it. It's funny that you just, sometimes it was more extreme than other times, but, and so I just let myself have that truth and let go of it. And it wasn't easy, trying to be an artist and basically supporting, that life. But I just let myself do it. I mean, one time I knew I was going to be done. I'd go, okay, I'm going to be done. And I remember for 6 months, all I did was completely form in my mind what I was going to do next. I didn't even touch it. Every walk I took, as I said, I walk endlessly. I was like seeing, and so when I just said, no, that's really it. I mean, it was a little gray. I had to go a little past my deadline just because some things, but it's really hard to do, but I think I only did it. I didn't do it because I thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if I just kept changing my work every 5 or 6 years? I really did get to a point, and it's odd. I just think everyone's different in that way. So I just think that a person, if you feel stuck, I think it's important if you recognize that, and a lot of people incrementally, change so they don't ever get there. I would say that about my friend Ellen, that her work has changed so much, but it's been more like you just don't go to her studio and she's got a completely different thing that she was doing before, but it's evolved enormously. So I'm just a different person like that. And it's hard to do different kinds of work. There have been different times where I have had to do it differently. Sometimes I actually had 2 different studios for a long time. I had a sculpture studio, a little room downstairs, and when I was making the more production, the vases that I was talking about, because I also had 2 children and I just had too many compartments. I had to compartmentalize them. So I would work on my sculpture for 2 weeks, and I would actually have someone do the slip casting for me for 2 weeks. Then I would go up and glaze them all and do blah, blah, blah. So that was the most compartmentalized I ever did. And then I gave up that studio and started having an apprentice. And now, I go back and forth, but I find that I still need to have sometimes just concentrated, all I'm doing is this one thing. And other times I'm able to really go around and really balance those things over there with those things. So it's not an easy answer thing.
And for me, not having another body of work that I'm dividing my time between, it's really just for me, what has always felt like an amazingly natural progression of change in the forms. And I have never been a person that believes in change for change's sake. I make things, I respond to them. As soon as, like you say, they lose their juice, they're gone. And I've been privileged enough, even though I've been making a living from this and having to deal with galleries and orders. And it's like, once that teapot is done, there's no ordering that teapot. It's just gone. And you just move on to the next. And lucky to cultivate people who are willing to just take what I have energy for, because, well, that's smart. It's going to be livelier and a better choice. But yeah, it just very, very much seems to be a natural progression. I'm hardly ever out of ideas for shapes and forms. Hardly ever.
And you two have such a wealth of wisdom still to impart. But since time is short and we have a wonderful repast awaiting us, I want to say previously the artist said how they hope no one would feel shy about coming up to them personally, informally asking questions. That's so great. So we have space and time for that if you can stay. But first, please join me in thanking again our artists. Thank you. Turn this off. Without ladders. See you in there. Just gonna turn this off. Stop. On this right. Was I supposed to return this? I think so, right?
I think that was one of the 3 things.
Okay. Okay.
It was,
I think I know I have this, and this must be the. Okay. Good.
yeah.
Turn everything off. Oh, it's really.
What's that? Oh, thank you. It always is a nerve-wracking thing, but it always goes all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh, it seems to be a purely joyful experience from start to finish. Yeah. I wish I had another day. I'm gonna go get Donna.
Don't worry, complete this. All right. I'm glad I talked to you. Yeah, I'll send that to tomorrow. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.